In 30 days, his unit would be disbanded, and he himself would be sent to the front lines of the assault infantry, where recruits survived an average of 4 days. Such were the terms of the military contract for anyone who chose a non-combat role. Arlen read these lines on the parchment and felt his fingers grow cold. The kingdom of Westmar had been at war with Caldric for 3 years, and there was such a shortage of men that even orphans from the outskirts were being conscripted. On the day of the assignment, 400 recruits gathered in the town square of Heldorn. The crystal of choice hung above the platform, and each man stepped forward and named his class. Strong young men chose to be swordsmen and were met with roars of approval. The gifted chose to be mages, and the crowd gasped. Arlen stood at the end of the line in a borrowed jacket with patches on the elbows. He had calculated everything in advance. Combat classes were dying on the front lines by the hundreds each week. Artisans were sent to military forges where they worked 18-hour shifts. And only farmers were given land and the obligation to supply food. The army always needs food. Farmers weren't sent into battle. Arlen stepped onto the platform and announced his class. Farmer. There was a moment of silence. Then the square erupted in laughter. An assignment officer named Garrett looked at him as if he were dirt under his boot. He said that for the first time in 3 years of war, a healthy young man had voluntarily chosen a class for the elderly and the disabled. The crystal flashed a dim green light. It was the weakest response of the entire day. Rank F. The ability was listed in the scroll as a single line. What is planted sprouts? Garrett read it aloud, and the crowd laughed again. Then he unfolded the map of allotments and smirked. He said there were no vacant plots left in the rear, and by law, a newcomer receives the outermost allotment from the fund. The outermost plot turned out to be number 17 in Ash Valley. Arlen heard the name and felt a knot tighten inside him. Ash Valley lay 2 days' journey east of the old front line. The land there had been abandoned after the monster's breakthrough 5 years ago. The plot's previous 17 owners were listed as dead or missing. Garrett added a condition to the contract aloud so everyone could hear. In 30 days, an inspector would arrive to check the harvest. No harvest meant the contract would be terminated, and the owner would head to the front as a private in the assault infantry. He asked the crowd how long assault infantrymen lived, and the crowd cheerfully bellowed, 4 days. Arlen silently took the scroll and the owner's seal. There was no one to argue with. The law is the law, and war will excuse everything. He spent his last coins on a sack of barley seeds and an old shovel and left the city onto the eastern highway. For 2 days, he walked past abandoned villages. The roofs had caved in. The wells were overgrown. The remains of carts and the armor of the fallen rusted on the roadside. War had swept through here and moved on. But the debris remained. By evening on the second day, he climbed a hill and saw his plot of land. Ash Valley lived up to its name. Gray earth, charred tree stumps. In the middle of the valley stood a crooked house with a collapsed roof and the remains of a stockade. And around the valley, on the ridges of the hills, Arlen made out movement. Stocky gray creatures roamed among the rocks. Ash wolves, a pack of 30. Further north, bony vultures circled above the cliffs. And by the dried-up riverbed, the entrance to an old burrow loomed dark, and the stench of rot wafted from it. Lot number 17 was surrounded by monsters on 3 sides. Now Arlen understood the fate of the 16 previous owners. He waited until dark and made his way down to the house in short, quick bursts. The wolves stayed on the ridges at night, and he slipped past them. The door hung by a single hinge. Inside, it smelled of dust and old blood. Arlen propped the door open with a beam and sat down by the cold hearth. He unrolled the scroll of ability and reread the single line 10 times. What is planted will sprout. No numbers, no description, no conditions. The most useless gift in the entire history of the crystal. In the morning, he went out to check the ground and realized his second problem. The soil was dead. Gray dust and elbows depth deep. barley would never sprout in soil like this. 30 days. Dead soil. 30 wolves on the ridge. He methodically walked the perimeter of the plot, staying in the lowlands. Behind the house near the remains of a palisade, he found traces of the last battle. A shattered shield, shreds of chainmail, and a broken sword stuck in the ground up to the hilt. The blade had snapped off at the guard about the size of a palm. Someone had fought here and lost. Arlen pulled out the shard and weighed it in his hand. You can't sell something like this. You can't fight with something like this. He had already raised his arm to toss the scrap of metal into the ravine when he suddenly stopped. A line from the scroll popped into his head of its own accord. What is planted sprouts? The word seed wasn't there. The word planted was. The thought was so foolish it made his ears ring. Arlen stood in the middle of the dead valley with a shard of a sword in his hand, arguing with himself. Then he decided that a man with dead earth and 30 days left to live had nothing left to lose. He dug a hole an elbow deep. He lowered the shard of the blade into it, hilt up. He covered it with gray dust. He poured water from his flask over it, and he felt something twitch beneath his ribs. A thin thread of warmth stretched from his chest through his arm into the ground. The earth above the hole stirred ever so slightly. Arlen recoiled and stood over the garden bed until dusk, but nothing else happened. That night, he lay on the floor of his house and listened to the wolves howling on the ridge. He told himself he was going mad. That driving iron into the ground was the delusion of a man dying of fear. Toward morning, a sound woke him. A quiet creak, like the creak of growing bamboo. The sound came from the yard. Arlen grabbed a shovel and peered through the gap in the wall. In the gray light of dawn, a sprout standing knee-high stood above the garden bed. The stem had a metallic sheen. Instead of leaves, thin steel plates unfurled along it. And at the tip of the sprout, a tiny but perfectly smooth blade was slowly growing, radiating a gleam. The shovel slipped from Arlen's hands. What is planted sprouts? He had planted the broken sword, and the sword had sprouted. Arlen had chosen the F-rank farmer class with the ability What is Planted Sprouts and received deadly plot number 17 in Ash Valley, on the condition that he present his harvest in 30 days or face the front lines. The plot is surrounded by a pack of ash wolves, bone vultures, and a burrow by the river, and the soil is dead. Arlen planted the broken sword he had found, and by morning, a metallic sprout with a growing blade had emerged from the ground. Arlen knelt before the sprout and held his breath. The steel plates of its leaves caught the dawn light. The blade at the tip was no longer than a finger, but it was growing right before his eyes. By noon, the sprout had grown to Arlen's waist. By evening, it was already a small tree as tall as a man, with 4 branches, and on each branch a narrow blade was forming from metal. A thread of warmth beneath his ribs stretched toward the tree constantly, and Arlen felt it as naturally as he felt his own hand. He sensed that the tree lacked nourishment. Not water, not sunlight. Iron. The tree was consuming the metal from the shard at its roots, and the shard was running out. Arlen remembered the scraps of chainmail by the stockade. He brought them over and buried them at the roots. The tree shuddered with every plate and drew the metal toward itself. Overnight, the chainmail sank completely into the ground, and the blades on the branches doubled in length. Then Arlen understood the most important thing. His gift wasn't about barley. His gift was about iron. And the war had scattered more iron across these lands than stones. The following days merged into a single work cycle. He would set out before dawn while the wolves slept in their den on the northern ridge. He would make his way around the old battle sites along the edge of the valley. He would gather rusty spearheads, shards of blades, buckles, and horseshoes into his sack. He would return and bury his haul at the tree's roots. By the 5th day, the tree stood taller than the house and bore 11 blades. By the 7th day, The first blade on the lower branch had fully formed, and the stem at its base had dried out. Arlen grasped the hilt, and the blade detached of its own accord, just as a ripe apple detaches from a branch. He brought the sword into the light and froze. This was not the rusty scrap he had planted. The steel shimmered like gray silk. The edge was as straight as a string. Arlen slashed at a palisade post, and the blade sank 2 palms deep into the old wood without effort. He knew nothing about weapons, but even he understood that such a sword would be a credit to present to an officer. And 10 more like it were ripening on the tree. The valley itself had arranged the test. On the 9th day, Arlen was returning with his prey when he was delayed. The sun had already risen, and 3 ash-gray wolves came down from the ridge, cutting him off. The beasts came up to his chest, gray, gaunt, hungry. In the past, Arlen would have run. Now a blade he'd forged hung at his back. The first wolf leaped, and Arlen swung at it clumsily but with all his might. The blade sliced the beast from shoulder to rib so easily that Arlen himself could barely stay on his feet. The second wolf clamped down on his bag. A third lunged from the side and tore his jacket and the skin beneath it. Arlen howled in pain and slashed blindly until it was all over. He stood over the 3 carcasses, shaking, clutching his side with his palm, and laughing out loud for the first time in a month. The blade in his hand was unscathed. That same evening, he dug a second garden bed. He placed the broken shield from the palisade into it. 2 days later, a bush with broad plate-like leaves sprouted from the ground, and Arlen harvested its first crop: bracers, a shoulder guard, and a chest plate. The armor fit him as if the bush had taken his measurements while it was growing. A day later, the first person ever stopped by the house. Mads, the junk dealer, traveled through the Deadlands in a creaking cart, collecting scrap metal from the war to be melted down. He was a wiry old man with the eyes of a dealer who had seen it all and believed nothing. He looked at the young man in his homemade armor and asked if it had been stripped from a corpse. Arlen replied that he'd grown it himself. Mads laughed a coughing laugh and asked him not to take him for a fool. Then Arlen led him over to the tree. Mads fell silent mid-laugh. He stood beneath the branches with the blades taking shape, and his expression shifted from mockery through disbelief to greedy amazement. He touched the sheet of steel, pulled his hand back, touched it again. Then he took off his hat. The old man had been trading in iron for 40 years and said he'd never seen steel like this, not even among the dwarf caravans. He immediately offered as much silver for a single blade as Arlen had never held in his hands in his entire life. Arlen sold 2 swords and bought all the scrap from Mads's cart. The old man rode off, glancing back, and Arlen watched him go with a heavy heart. The scrap dealer would remain silent until he reached the first inn. But iron was more important than secrets. The scrap from the wagon was buried in the ground within 3 days. Arlen dug 6 garden beds, swords, spears, axes, a chainmail bush. He was assembling his own life. He dug, he hauled, he buried, he harvested. His side was healing poorly, and every swing of the shovel sent a burning pain through him, but he couldn't stop. On the 14th day, he was awakened not by the creaking of sprouts, but by a howl full of hungry fury from the northern ridge. Arlen peered out and grew cold. The pack had caught the scent of the 3 dead men and the smell of a man who had been dragging himself through the valley for 2 weeks. The wolves no longer roamed the ridge. The entire pack flowed like a gray torrent down the slope toward the house. 27 beasts. Arlen counted them twice. He had 9 ready-to-use blades, 4 spears, and armor, and 1 pair of hands. He looked at the arsenal, which would have been enough for a squad. There was no squad. There were 6 hours left until sunset, and the wolves walked unhurriedly, like masters coming to claim what was theirs. Arlen had discovered that his gift allowed him to forge superior weapons and armor from buried metal. so he had organized the collection of scrap metal throughout the valley. He killed 3 wolves, forged himself some armor, and sold 2 blades to the junk dealer Mads, who was amazed by the quality of the steel and would surely spread the word. By the 14th day, the entire pack of 27 ash-gray wolves had marched on the farm, while Arlen stood alone, armed with 9 blades, 4 spears, and his armor. Arlen hauled all the finished weapons into the house and realized that the house wouldn't save him. The walls were riddled with holes, and the door was held up by a beam. 27 wolves would tear this ruin apart in an hour. His gaze darted around the yard in search of an exit and settled on the far garden bed. 3 days ago, he'd buried a strange find there, something from an old burrow by the river. A stone sphere the size of 2 fists with faded runes around its rim. Mads called such things golem cores and said that a dead core wasn't worth a penny. Arlen had planted it out of sheer stubbornness. Yesterday, a thick gray stem had risen above the garden bed, bearing a bud that looked like a stone cabbage. Now the bud was stirring. Arlen ran over and saw the stone petals unfolding one by one. At its core sat a little man about knee-high. His body was made of clay and stone. Arlen's runes glowed warmly on his chest with the same light as the thread beneath his ribs. The little man opened eyes like river pebbles and looked at Arlen with a dog's alertness. 4 more buds swayed nearby. There was no time for wonder. Arlen pointed at a pile of poles and ordered them to be carried to the breach in the palisade. The golem understood without a word. He wasn't as strong as the war golems of legend, but he worked like a man possessed and never grew tired. By noon, the remaining buds had opened. 5 little workers hauled poles, stones, and fragments of wagons, and Arlen used them to build a barricade across the narrowest passage into the courtyard. He blocked the other approaches with a hedge of spears, their points jutting outward. The plan was pathetic, but there was no other. To intercept the pack at the bottleneck where the wolves couldn't all rush in at once. The wolves arrived an hour before sunset. They encircled the courtyard, and Arlen could hear their breathing from all sides. Then, the alpha howled, and the gray bodies surged into the bottleneck. Arlen remembered the first hour in flashes. A spear snaps in a wolf's chest. He snatches a second one from the ground. The blade of cultivated steel cleaves wolf skulls like cabbages, and that alone saves him. Jaws clamp down on his bracers, and the plates hold the bite that would have shattered bone. The golems hurled stones from behind the barricade. One golem perished beneath the wolves' paws, shattered into clay shards. The wolves retreated and returned again. By nightfall, Arlen stood in the pass, ankle-deep in gray fur, and could no longer feel his hands. 11 carcasses lay before the barricade. The pack was hungry but not frenzied. Having lost a third of their numbers, the wolves howled from the ridge and headed north in search of easier prey. Arlen slid down the poles to the ground and wept from exhaustion and from the fact that he was alive. In the morning, he and the 2 surviving golems gathered the spoils of battle. 11 carcasses, hides, fangs, and most importantly, insight. A defense consisting of a single man would not survive the next pack. He didn't need workers. He needed soldiers. He went down to the old burrow where he'd taken the first cannonball. The burrow turned out to be the entrance to a buried outpost from a long-ago war. For 3 days, Arlen and the golems cleared away the rubble and hauled out rusty iron and dead projectiles. 7 projectiles. An entire arsenal for the future. He buried the projectiles alongside the weapons, a projectile and a blade in each hole, a projectile and a shield in another. Dar understood him without words. New buds grew larger, and from them emerged golems that reached Arlen's waist, with steel plates embedded in the clay and blades in place of their right hands. Little soldiers, slow, dull, loyal. By the 25th day, the farm had changed beyond recognition. The garden beds stood in rows. The weapon tree was bearing its 3rd harvest. 8 worker golems were repairing the palisade, and 6 soldier golems stood guard at the entrance day and night. And then the inspector arrived. Arlen had been expecting an official with grain scales, but instead a wagon arrived with a guard of 4 spearmen and the quartermaster of the eastern garrison, a man named Borgen. He was a heavy-set man whose face, after years of service, had taken on a permanent expression of distrust. Word from the junk dealer had reached the right ears. Borgen climbed down from the wagon and announced that, under the contract, he was obligated to assess the harvest and, as part of his duty, he was required to verify the rumors about the steal. He spoke in the tone of a man who had come to catch a fraudster. Arlen silently led him into the yard. Borgen saw the tree and stopped as if struck by a blow. 12 blades hung from the branches, and the evening sun glinted off the steel. For 20 years, the quartermaster had been accepting weapons from the finest smithies in Westmar. He took a fully formed sword from a branch. He bent it. He let it spring back. He examined the edge, straight as a beam. He swung it at the wagon and split the oak side in one motion. Then Borgen turned to Arlen, and on his frozen face, disbelief slowly gave way to something halfway between horror and delight. He said that dwarf-forged blades were mere scrap metal compared to this. He asked how much the farm produced per week. Arlen replied that with the iron delivery, it was 10 blades and 5 sets of armor. Borgen sat down on the wrecked wagon next to the side panel. 4 spearmen from the guard watched the soldier golems in the pass, and one of them kept cursing under his breath. The quartermaster drew up a document stating that the harvest had been delivered and the contract fulfilled. His hand was trembling. Then he bought all the finished weapons for full-weight silver on behalf of the garrison and promised to send a wagon load of scrap iron. As he drove away, he looked back 3 times. Arlen stood in the middle of his farm with the document that had saved him from the front and realized one simple thing. Borgen was obligated to file a report. The report would go to Heldorn and then to the capital. The word farm would appear in it alongside the word weapons. And in a kingdom at war, such words are read very carefully by a wide variety of people. 4 days later, at dawn, the sentry golem tapped a stone against his shield. Arlen climbed onto the barricade and saw on the southern road not a wagon train carrying scrap metal. A mounted detachment without banners was heading toward the farm. 12 riders in mismatched armor. The king's soldiers don't ride like that. That's how deserters ride. Those who've discovered where the weapons grow and decided there's no one left to guard them. Arlen first raised 5 worker golems from the dead cannonballs, and after the battle with the pack, he began embedding the cannonballs alongside the weapons, producing soldier golems with blades instead of hands. The wolf pack was defeated at the cost of 1 golem, and 7 cores were recovered from the buried outpost. Quartermaster Borgen confirmed the contract. He was amazed by the quality of the steel, bought up the entire harvest, and promised a scrap convoy. But his report will go up the chain of command, and a detachment of 15 horsemen, without banners, resembling deserters, is already on its way to the farm. 15 horsemen against a single farmer and 6 small soldiers. Arlen was weighing the odds while the detachment trotted along the southern road, and he didn't like what he saw. The soldier golems were only waist-high and slow-moving. The horsemen would crush them without a second thought. But the farm had something the visitors lacked. The farm knew its land. Arlen ordered the worker golems to scatter a barricade at the entrance and leave the courtyard temptingly open. He trapped the soldiers' golems in old wolf pits along the passageway and covered them with ash. He himself stood in the middle of the courtyard by the weapon tree, in plain sight. The bait had to be tempting. The squad was lured into the bottleneck without scouting. The deserters had been plundering the dead lance for 3 years and were no longer used to resistance. The leader, wearing a captured officer's breastplate, bellowed from his saddle that they needed the sorcerer and his iron garden, and that anyone who didn't make a move might even survive. Arlen raised his hand and let it fall. The ground along the passageway split open. 6 blades struck the horse's legs from below, and in an instant, the pass turned into a chaotic scene of falling horses and people. The worker golems brought down a prepared pile of logs onto the exit from the gorge, and the squad found itself trapped. What followed was not a battle but a stampede. in which Arlen, wielding a grown blade and clad in grown armor, fought as best he could, that is, fiercely and unsightly. The plates withstood blows that made his vision go dark. The blade hacked through the captured chainmail as if it were canvas. The soldier golems clung to the fallen and wouldn't let go. A quarter of an hour later, it was all over. The 7 deserters lay dead. 5 had surrendered and sat bound by the palisade. 3 rode off toward the south. The leader was the last to surrender. He sat on the ground, staring at the golem who had pressed a blade to his throat, and kept repeating that such things didn't happen. Arlen took every piece of metal from the prisoners, down to the last buckle, 15 sets of armor and weapons. His gift was the best supply convoy ever received. He released the prisoners on foot and barefoot to head south, fully aware of what he was doing and why. The survivors would tell the story. Fear, too, is a harvest. Over the next few days, the farm expanded with new construction. The scrap wagon from Borgen arrived as promised, followed by a second and a third. The raised beds took up all the space up to the old riverbed. There were now 4 weapon trees. The chainmail bushes stood as a hedge. There were 16 soldier golems, and the new ones were sprouting larger than the previous ones because Arlen had learned to plant 2 cores in a single hole. He slept for 5 hours, and the thread under his ribs hummed with tension like a rope, but it held. On the 39th day, it wasn't a supply wagon that arrived. 100 regular cavalrymen approached the farm under Westmar's blue banner, and Arlen saw for the first time what the attention of the powerful players looked like. The detachment was commanded by Knight Edric from the headquarters of the Eastern Army. Young, well-groomed, with the face of a man who'd been tasked with verifying a preposterous report and who was already annoyed at the wasted time. Edric rode into the courtyard without dismounting and reported that Quartermaster Borgen had submitted a report so delusional that headquarters had decided to take a look for themselves before putting the clerk on trial for drunkenness. He spoke through clenched teeth and looked right over Arlen's head. Then he saw the courtyard. Arlen watched the familiar change in his expression. Boredom slipped away first. Anger followed. Edric slowly dismounted by the weapons tree, where 12 blades caught the midday sun. He walked past the line of soldier golems, who turned their heads toward him like sunflowers toward the light. He stopped at the chainmail fence and touched the living rings. The staff knight had seen the capital's armories, the trophy depots, and the dwarven caravans. He turned to Arlen and asked very quietly how much the farm could supply to the army in a month. Arlen answered honestly, 40 blades, 20 sets of armor, and 10 soldier golems, provided there was an uninterrupted supply of iron. Edric was silent, spoke at length. Then he said that for figures like these, warring kingdoms slaughtered one another without mercy, and that the young man himself didn't understand what he was up against. He left a dozen horsemen at the farm as a garrison and galloped off to headquarters, urging his horses on. And 2 days after his departure, something happened that Arlen later recalled as the true turning point of the entire story. At night, a sentry golem caught a man by the old riverbed. A skinny vagrant in rags begged for a place to sleep and gave evasive answers about where he was coming from. Arlen was about to let him go when he noticed that the vagrant was scrutinizing the garden beds too intently and keeping his back too straight. A search revealed a copper token with Caldrec's wolf's head sewn into his rags, along with a wax-sealed tablet bearing numbers. 40 blades, 20 suits of armor, 10 golems. The numbers Arlen had mentioned to Edric the day before yesterday in the middle of the courtyard, in front of 10 mounted garrison soldiers. The spy had been heading east toward the border for only half a day. Oh, he'd been captured by chance. Arlen sat up all night poring over the copper token, piecing together the rest of the chain of events. Caldrec now knows about the farm. Caldrec has been at war with Westmar for 3 years and is losing the battle for iron. A farm that grows weapons changes the entire balance of the war. That means Caldrec will try to steal the farm. And if he can't steal it, he'll burn it down so that no one else can have it. In the morning, a garrison messenger took the scout and the report to headquarters. By evening, a distant column of smoke rose from the east, near the border beyond the dead hills. Then a second, then a third. Westmar's patrol line lit signal fires. Enemy troops were crossing the border. Arlen ambushed a detachment of deserters, seized 15 sets of equipment, and released the prisoners to spread fear. The farm had expanded to 4 weapon trees and 16 soldier golems, and Edric, the staff knight, having witnessed its power and heard the production figures, left a dozen mounted garrison troops behind. A captured Caldric scout already knew these figures, and by evening, signal fires blazed along the eastern border because Caldric's troops had crossed the line. It was a 2-day ride to the border, which meant the farm had 2 days to prepare for war. The garrison foreman, named Halvar, watched the signal smoke and said that Caldric's raiding party was moving quickly and traveling light, and that 10 horsemen and a crowd of clay dolls wouldn't stop them. He suggested they burn the farm themselves and retreat to the garrison. Arlen listened and understood that according to military strategy, the foreman was right. And then he said he wouldn't give up the farm because a farm isn't just a few garden beds. The farm is him. A thread running beneath his ribs connected him to every sprout and every golem, and to abandon it would be like cutting off his own hands. For 2 days, Ash Valley did not sleep. Arlen dug up every last scrap of iron, down to the very last nail, and planted the pass and its approaches so densely that the earth bulged. He planted not for maturity, but for speed. The gift responded to his desperation, and the sprouts burst from the ground 3 times faster than usual. A spear-toothed harrow rose along the entire southern passage like a living hedge of slanted blades. The worker golems deepened the old riverbed into a moat. Arlen transplanted the chainmail bushes onto the barricade, and they wove the rings directly into the logs. And in the very depths of the courtyard, he did what he had previously lacked the courage and iron to do. Into a single enormous hole, he placed the deserters' leader's officer's breastplate, 4 cannonballs bound together, and the finest blade of the 3rd harvest. The earth above the hole swelled into a mound, and the mound breathed. Caldric's detachment emerged into the valley at dawn on the 3rd day. Arlen counted about 70 men from the ridge, light infantry with ladders and pots of oil, and 24 horsemen. They were led by a mercenary captain in blackened armor, who lined up his men competently and without haste. These men had not come to plunder. They had come to take or burn. Halvar stood with his cavalry in reserve behind the courtyard, his face that of a man bidding farewell in advance. The first wave charged head-on at the narrow pass, shielded by their shields. The spear wall met the shields, and the formation buckled. From the dugout pits, the soldiers' golems, now 22 in number, struck, and the passageway became cramped with iron and screams. Arlen stood on the barricade, firing a captured crossbow, while the worker golems fed him charges on a conveyor belt. The captain, clad in blackened armor, pulled his men back, reorganized them, and sent the cavalry around via the old riverbed. The cavalry charged into the deepened moat at full speed, and the riverbed reaped its harvest. But the captain knew his craft. The 3rd wave attacked immediately from both sides, accompanied by fire. Pots of oil flew over the palisade, and 2 weapon trees burst into flames. Arlen felt that fire like a thread beneath his ribs, as if it were a burn on his own skin, and he screamed. Caldric's infantry was scaling the barricade in 3 places. The soldiers' golems fought in silence and died in silence, their clay bodies cracking under the axes. Halvar struck the flank with his cavalry and got bogged down. Everything hung by a thread, and the thread was snapping. And then the breathing mound at the back of the courtyard opened up. A golem, 1.5 times the height of a man, rose from the ground. An officer's breastplate was fused to his chest like a bone of his own. The blade of the 3rd harvest had become his right arm from the elbow down. 4 cannonballs burned through the clay like 4 hearts. The first knight born of the farm took a step, and the barricade trembled. He entered the thick of the advancing infantry, and the slaughter began. He did not strike quickly, but every blow took down a man, while the enemy's axes bounced off his fused armor. Caldric's infantry consisted of veterans, but veterans know when all is lost. The formation collapsed. The captain in blackened armor tried to stop the fleeing soldiers, then turned his horse around and rode off last, snarling like a wolf. By noon, everything had quieted down. Arlen sat on the shattered barricade amid the smoke and watched as the worker golems covered the burning trees with earth. The farm had held out. The aftermath lay all around. 9 soldier golems were destroyed. 2 of Halvar's horsemen were dead. Neither of the 2 burned trees could be saved, and the loss echoed in his chest as a dull ache. Halvar approached, sat down beside him, and remained silent for a long time. The corporal had served in the East for 20 years, and just 3 days ago had called the golems clay dolls. Now he looked at the large golem standing motionless in the middle of the courtyard, with its blade lowered, and said that he had seen 2 true miracles in his life, and the second one today. He took off his helmet and asked permission to report to the garrison that the farm had held off 70 of Caldrec's men through the efforts of the owner and the harvest. That evening, a disheveled messenger from headquarters rode up, bringing 2 pieces of news. The first was good. Edric was leading 300 soldiers and a wagon train of iron to the farm, along with an order to set up a permanent camp around the valley. The messenger handed over the second piece of news in a separate scroll bearing the headquarters seal, his face ashen as he did so. Patrols had captured a prisoner from the fleeing detachment, and during interrogation, the prisoner revealed information that caused headquarters to put the entire Eastern Army on high alert. The raid had been merely a test run. Caldric valued the farm more highly than 3 border fortresses. A corps of 5,000 swordsmen, accompanied by siege engines and battle mages, was marching toward the border. Meanwhile, in Westmere itself, the scroll ordered them to await guests from the capital, for the farm had been reported to the king, and the crown would now decide to whom the land that sustained the army belonged. Arlen finished reading the scroll by the light of the campfire and looked out at his yard. The charred garden beds, a shattered barricade. 20 days ago, he had been the kingdom's most useless farmer, dreaming of weathering the war unnoticed. Now the continent's most powerful powers were gathering to fight over his gray, lifeless valley. He rolled up the scroll and ordered the golems to dig new garden beds right in the ashes. If the world was coming to him with war, then the harvest must be ripe by the time the guests arrived. In 2 days, the farm had been transformed into a fortress and repelled a raid by 70 of Caldrec's soldiers, losing 9 golems, 2 mounted units, and 2 weapon trees. The outcome of the battle was decided by the first great golem knight, forged from an officer's breastplate, 4 cannonballs, and the finest blade. Halvar, the skeptical squad leader, acknowledged the farm as a miracle, while Edric leads 300 soldiers and a convoy of iron to establish a permanent camp. A prisoner revealed that Caldric is sending a force of 5,000 swordsmen to the farm, along with siege engines and mages, and the Crown of Westmar has learned of the farm and is deciding on its ownership. Edric's 300 soldiers set up camp around the valley, and on the very first day, Arlen realized that salvation looked like a takeover. The knight had brought more than just iron and men. He had brought a document from headquarters declaring the farm a site of military importance and naming Edric himself its commander. Arlen read the document twice and asked what his status was according to it. Edric averted his gaze and replied that Arlen was the landowner and a valuable specialist under the crown's protection. He pronounced the word protection in such a way that it sounded like surveillance. The camp grew rapidly and in a military fashion. Ramparts, moats, watchtowers. The soldiers looked at the garden beds with superstitious horror and gave the golems a wide berth. Arlen worked from dawn till dusk because he understood one simple thing. As long as the farm produced a harvest, they would talk to him. Once the harvest was over, they would stop talking to him. Convoys of iron now arrived every day, and he had planted the entire old part of the valley and started a new one at the northern ridge. There were now 11 weapon trees, 40 soldier golems. He grew two more large knights and hid their planting holes in a far corner, under the guise of compost piles, because his instinct told him to have trump cards that weren't mentioned in the reports. 8 days later, guests arrived from the capital, and Arlen saw for the first time people for whom power was not a position, but a trait. The royal auditor Lord Wyndham arrived with an escort of 50 guards, accompanied by the crown mage in a gray cloak without insignia. Wyndham was a gaunt old man, as sharp as a razor. He toured the farm in an hour and asked 20 questions, each of which was a trap. Who taught him? Where did the gift come from? Who else had he shown it to? What would happen if the owner were taken to the capital and others were left to tend the land? To the last question, Arlen answered honestly that the sprouts would wither within a week without him, because they grew from a thread that extended from his body. At these words, the mage in the gray cloak looked up for the first time, and Arlen felt the stranger's gaze tracing the thread beneath his ribs with cold fingers. That evening, Wyndham announced the crown's decision. The farm would remain Arlen's. Arlen was granted the title of royal purveyor and the protection of the crown. In exchange, the entire harvest would go to the army at a fixed price, and he himself could not leave the valley without permission. It was a cage, a spacious one, gilded, with a feeding trough. Arlen signed because the choice between a cage and the block is no choice at all. And that night, after he signed, a mage in gray came to his house. He entered without knocking, sat down by the hearth, and spoke quietly and without preamble. He said he had served the crown for 30 years and had seen every kind of gift. Arlen's gift didn't fit any of them. The thread that Arlen called warmth didn't go into the ground. It went through the crying toward the ground, somewhere down below. And something from below answered. The mage asked if Arlen had ever felt that he wasn't the one pulling, but was being pulled. Arlen wanted to say no, but couldn't. Because he remembered the nights after the great plantings, when the thread hummed on its own, and in his dreams he saw endless fields of iron ears of grain beneath a black sky, and someone walking toward him across those fields from far away. The mage nodded at his silence, as if it were an answer. He said he wouldn't write about it in his report because the crown only knows how to rule, whereas here one must first understand. As he left, he turned back and added that such gifts never come for free, and that one day the bill would come due, and Arlen had better know by then who the creditor was. The door closed, and Arlen sat by the hearth until morning, listening to the thread. Meanwhile, the war was drawing nearer. Scouts reported that Kaldric's corps was 5 days away and was advancing not in a straight line, but in an arc, burning down outposts as it went. Edric was preparing the defenses and demanding the harvest be brought in faster, and Arlen was squeezing everything he could out of the gift. On the third day of the race, what he had feared since the first sprout appeared came to pass. He was planting a large patch, 20 holes at once, when the thread beneath his ribs suddenly tightened like a string and snapped with such pain that the world went white. He came to, on the ground. Blood was flowing from his mouth. The sprouts above the fresh holes stood black and dead, all 20 of them. And deep beneath the valley, something turned slowly and contentedly, like a sated beast in its sleep. The gift took not only iron, the gift took him. The camp healer ordered him to rest for a week. Arlen got up the next day because there was no week. He learned to sense the edge beyond which the thread would snap and to work just a step from that edge. The harvest came in again, but now every blade had a price that could not be entered on the ledger. By the end of the 5th day, smoke from the north had settled along the entire line, and retreating outposts began arriving at the camp. Stripped bare, scorched. They told of Kaldric's machines that hurled stones, coated with burning resin, over any wall, and of the fire mages who marched ahead of the corps, burning everything made of iron so that the farmer would have nothing left to plant. Kaldric was acting smart. He wasn't out to destroy the farm, he was out to destroy the harvest. The night before the corps approached, Arlen stood by the far pits where 2 great knights were maturing and spoke to them as if they were people.
even though they slept beneath the earth. He told them that tomorrow would be the longest day.
The ground above the pits trembled twice, as if the sleepers had heard him. And at dawn, the sentries sounded their horns from the watchtowers, and Arlen climbed the rampart and saw the horizon. Columns were advancing from the east across the entire width of the valley. 5,000 swords. Siege engines swayed over the formation like gallows. And at the head of the formation marched 10 figures in red, and wherever they stepped, the snow of ash melted into glass. The crown left Arlen's farm with the status of royal supplier, but locked him in the valley, while Edric became commandant of a camp of 300 soldiers. The crown's mage revealed that the thread of the gift extended deep into the earth, and something from below was responding. The overload during a heavy landing nearly killed Arlen, demonstrating that the gift exacts a toll from them as well. The farm had grown to 11 trees, 40 soldier golems, and 2 large knights maturing in secret, while Kaldrek's army of 5,000 swordsmen, along with siege engines and 10 battle mages, advanced toward the valley. 5,000 against 300 soldiers and the farm, that's not a battle. It's arithmetic, and Edric was the first to say it out loud. At the war council in the command tent, he spread out a map and pointed out their only chance. The valley had a narrow pass to the east and scree-covered ridges to the north and south. The corps could not enter all at once. It would pour through the pass like water through a funnel, and in a funnel, numbers matter less. They had to hold out for 6 days, because on the 7th day, the Eastern Army of Westmar, which had already broken camp from its winter quarters, would arrive. 6 days. Arlen listened and did his own calculations. 40 soldier golems, 2 large knights who would not be ready until the 3rd day, spiked harrows and ditches, and 11 trees that must be spared, because trees mean future harvests. Kaldrek spent the first day on reconnaissance in force and on the machines. From early morning, stones coated with burning resin rained down across the ridge in a sweeping arc, and the camp burned in 3 places until the soldiers dragged their tents away just in case. Arlen ordered the worker golems to coat the trees with wet clay from the moat, and the clay saved 2 trunks from incendiary strikes. By evening, Kaldrek's infantry had tested the narrow pass, suffered heavy losses at the harrow, and retreated, leaving behind 50 bodies. Arlen didn't sleep that night. He was planting. The supply of iron was running low, so he used all the trophies from the first day, which the soldiers had stripped from the dead under cover of darkness, to fill the holes. The war had begun to sustain the farm on its own. The 2nd day belonged to the mages. 10 red figures emerged at the neck of the valley at dawn and struck not at the people but at the ground. Fire flowed across the soil like water, and wherever it flowed, the spade-tooth harrow melted and sank into the earth. Arlen stood on the rampart and could feel, as if by a thread, the sprouts screaming, and that scream turned him inside out. The crown mage in a gray cloak stood beside him and began weaving a counterspell, and the air between the rampart and the red figures thickened like glass. The gray one held off the 10 for nearly an hour. Blood trickled from his nose and ears, but he bought them that hour. During that hour, Edric led the cavalry through the southern scree along a secret path shown to them by the locals and struck the mages on the flank. 2 of the red figures were trampled. The rest fell back behind the lines, and no more fire flowed until evening. But the harrow at the neck of the pass was half destroyed, and that meant the infantry would advance deeper tomorrow. Arlen remembered the 3rd day as the longest of his life, just as he had promised the sleeping knights. Kaldrek sent 1,000 men into the bottleneck at once, and the wave reached the moat, crossed it, and reached the rampart. Everyone was fighting on the rampart, soldiers, wagoners, and Arlen with his grown blade. The soldiers' golems stood in the breaches like rivets in a tearing seam. By noon, the seam began to tear in 3 places at once, and then, in the far corner of the courtyard, 2 compost heaps burst open. 2 large knights emerged from the ground a day ahead of schedule, because Arlen had reached with a thread to the edge and beyond and called out. For going overboard, the gift demanded payment immediately. His legs gave out, and he watched the battle unfold of the battle, sitting with his back to a charred tree trunk. The knights entered the breaches and plugged them with their bodies. The first swung his blade like a pendulum. The second simply walked through the ranks, and the ranks parted, breaking apart. 1,000 retreated from the bottleneck, leaving 400 behind. That evening, in the medic's tent, Arlen lay with his legs useless, listening to the report. The losses were terrible. 1/3 of the soldiers, 18 golems. But we're holding our ground. And that night, Halvar came and sat down beside him and shared news that was worse than the casualties. A patrol had intercepted Caldrick's messenger and found the order on him. The corps commander had received a new objective from his capital: not to capture the farm, not to burn it, to take the owner alive. Caldrick understood what the Crown of Westmar had understood. The farm is not land. The farm is a man. They won't come for the man in formation. They'll come for him at night, silently. The 4th day passed in a strange lull. The corps stood still. The machines rumbled lazily. Edric didn't trust the silence, and he was right. On the night of the 5th day, they came. Not through the pass. Across the northern ridge, over the scree where a column couldn't pass, but lone figures could. A dozen shadows, gray against gray. Masters of the night. They took out the 2 sentries silently and made their way to the doctor's tent, where the farm owner lay, and everything was going according to plan. Except for one thing. They were walking through the garden beds. And the beds were alive, and a thread stretched from the owner to every sprout. Arlen didn't wake up because of a sound. It was a touch. Someone foreign was walking along his nerves. He screamed before he even opened his eyes, and his scream roused the camp, while he himself pulled the thread with all his remaining strength. The earth along the northern garden beds split open. Unripe blades lashed out of the holes like grass in the wind. The chainmail bush by the tent clamped its rings around the first of the shadows and held it until the soldiers arrived. The skirmish in the darkness was brief and vicious. In the morning, 11 bodies in gray were gathered from the garden beds. The 12th was not found. Halvar, following the tracks, said that one had gone back through the scree, and that this one had seen everything. He knew that one could not approach the master, while the master was on his own land. Arlen sat by the tent, his legs numb from the cold by morning, and understood the continuation of that thought just as clearly as the one who had fled had understood it. If one cannot approach the master on his land, then the master must be lured off his land. Or one must ensure that the land ceases to be his. And on the 6th day, toward evening, when everyone was waiting for the final assault, the horizon to the west, behind the camp, sent dust billowing up to the sky. The Eastern Army of Westmar had arrived a day ahead of schedule, 12,000. Caldrick's corps had broken camp during the night and retreated across the border, fighting off rearguards, and the valley held its ground. It held out. The camp roared with joy until their voices were hoarse. Arlen did not roar. He looked from the rampart toward the east, where the enemy was retreating, and toward the west, from where his own army was approaching, and felt like a grain of wheat caught between 2 millstones that had only just begun to close in. The farm and Edric's 300 men held the pass against the corps for 6 days, losing 1/3 of their soldiers, 18 golems, and half their harrows. The turning point on the 3rd day came from 2 great knights, called up ahead of schedule at the cost of Arlen's legs. Caldrick shifted his objective from capturing the farm to capturing Arlen himself alive, and a night party of 12 assassins was wiped out by the living garden beds. Though one escaped with the knowledge that the master could not be taken on his own land. The Eastern Army, numbering 12,000, arrived a day early, and the corps retreated across the border. The victory brought a new regime to the valley, and the new regime's first act was to begin dividing up what belonged to others. General Osmond, commander of the Eastern Army, rode onto the farm on the third day after the siege was lifted. He was a man whose voice was accustomed to drowning out the clamor of battle, and who was convinced that everything in the world fell into two categories: his resources and his obstacles. He walked around the garden beds as one might walk through a captured warehouse. He looked at the large knights and calculated aloud how many of them would be needed to reach the capital of Kaldrek by summer. Then he summoned Arlen to the command tent and, without preamble, announced the plan. The farm is being relocated, in its entirety, deep into the rear, to the walls of Darnhall Fortress, where neither the corps nor the assassins can reach it. Arlen was given the rank of quartermaster and a salary. No objections were to be tolerated. Arlen asked how the general intended to move the thread that had grown into this earth to a depth that no one had ever measured. Osmond replied that the gift lay in the man, not in the dirt, and that the man would go to Darnhall, either willingly or under escort. The earth itself settled the dispute. As a test, they dug up 3 young weapon trees with their root balls intact and hauled them away on carts. By evening of the first day of the journey, the trees had turned black. By morning of the second, they had crumbled into rusty dust. Arlen himself lay feverish for those 2 days, and the thread beneath his ribs howled like a dog for its master, even though he himself was not going anywhere. The Mage of the Grey Crown laid the conclusion before Osmond. The gift is bound to the place. More precisely, the place is bound to what lies beneath it. Transfer is impossible. The general read it, crumpled the paper, and said that in that case, the rear would come here. And the rear guard arrived. Within a month, Ash Valley ceased to be a valley and became a military town. 12,000 men set up a permanent camp along the ridges. Engineers carved the slopes to build ramparts and towers. Market vendors and families of craftsmen streamed in from Heldorn, and the valley became overgrown with settlements. The crown sent iron in caravans, and Arlen now sowed the fields. 40 trees, 120 soldier golems, 8 large knights whom the soldiers called reapers. Arlen was learning to cope with a new scale, and the new scale was teaching him. He put veterans who were gardeners in charge of the garden beds. He started a planting log. He discovered that if he planted a slain warrior's weapon next to his own armor, the sprout would grow twice as strong, as if the iron remembered its master and wanted to continue serving him. He did not record this discovery in the book, but hid it in his memory, alongside his dreams of the Black Fields. The dreams grew more frequent. The figure approaching him through the iron ears of grain was no longer just a dot on the horizon, but a distinct figure, and that figure cast a shadow across half the sky. Meanwhile, the farm's fame had spread beyond the borders. First, the embassy of the mountain gnomes arrived. The elder of the smithies, named Torvald Kamnegrod, walked silently among the garden beds for 3 days, his beard trembling. For 9 centuries, the gnomes had believed that the soul of steel could be unlocked only by a hammer. Here, steel grew like grass and was better than their very best. On the 4th day, Torvald asked permission to plant with his own hands the blade of his fallen son, which he had carried on his back for 20 years. Arlen granted his request and helped him, and when, a week later, a sprout emerged from the hole bearing a blade of the same pattern, but purer and brighter, the old dwarf knelt before the garden bed. As he departed, he left behind a wagon load of the finest gnome ore and a promise that the mountains would henceforth be no enemies to the farmer. Next came envoys from the trading republic of Liven with an offer of gold, enough to buy a duchy. Then a mysterious man from across the southern sea. Then a letter from the steppe frontier, sent by the nomadic Kagan, asking a single question: how much does it cost to raise a horse? Arlen replied to everyone the same way, that the harvest belonged to the Crown of Westmar under the treaty. And the Crown took stock. Auditor Wyndham arrived again, this time with an entire administrative office and a new treaty in which the fixed price was replaced by a government-set price, and a Crown administrator was assigned to the farm. The noose was tightening. Arlen signed again and again. remaining silent about the most important thing, that he was now planting every 10th crop secretly at night in a remote clearing beyond the northern ridge, where neither the chancellery nor the patrols ventured. There, in the darkness, his own unaccounted-for harvest was ripening. Not for the crown, for the day when the millstones would come together. In the fall, trouble came from the direction they least expected. Caldric remained silent all fall, and the reason for his silence turned out to be terrifying. Their capital had found its master. Patrols brought back rumors from across the border, then prisoners, then evidence. A man appeared at Caldrec's side who grew the living from dead flesh, just as Arlen had grown from dead iron. The fields beyond the border were no longer sown with grain. Bodies on both sides of the war were no longer buried. They were planted. And from foreign soil rose harvests for which people had no name other than the old word undead. The first such harvest reached the border in late fall, and the Westmar outpost saw, in the morning mist, orderly ranks of what had once been two armies. The dead were not afraid. They did not tire. They did not ask for pay. The war of gifts had begun. And on the first night of winter, Arlen had a new dream. The black fields were the same, but now two figures were walking toward each other across them. He himself was on one side, and someone wearing a crown of bones was on the other. A figure casting a shadow across half the sky stood between them like a judge at a duel, waiting. The attempt to relocate the farm failed because the gift was bound to a specific place and depth, so the army and its rearguard moved to a valley that became a military town with a settlement, while the farm grew to 40 trees, 120 soldier golems, and 8 reapers. Torvald's gnomes recognized the farm as a miracle and became allies. The crown tightened the treaty, and Arlen began secretly planting unaccounted-for crops at night in the ravine beyond the northern ridge. Caldric acquired his own master, who conjured the undead from dead bodies, and the war turned into a war of gifts. And in Arlen's dreams, a figure from the depths awaits a duel between the two sowers. The first clash between the two harvests took place in winter at the Wolf Ford outpost, and Westmar lost it. A regiment with 20 soldier golems and 1 reaper encountered 3,000 dead in the fog, and the dead traded themselves for the living at a profit. A golem chops at a corpse, but the corpse does not fall until it is completely severed. A living soldier stares into the face of his dead neighbor at the outpost, and the living soldier's hand drops. The regiment retreated, having lost its banner, and the reaper returned, scratched down to his heart cores, and Arlen spent 3 nights repairing him through replanting. General Osmond now demanded one thing: more blades, more reapers, more of everything, and faster. Arlen sewed at his limit and lived a step away from the edge beyond which the thread snaps. A man with gray hair at 20 stared back at him from the mirror. The answer to the dead
was found not in numbers, but in the wisdom of others. Torvald arrived with young blacksmiths, and the gnomes brought with them 9 centuries of knowledge about runes.
The gnome runes would not adhere to dead metal, but the steel they had forged was alive, and the runes took root in it like seeds in a furrow. Arlen began to plant blades inscribed with runes, and the trees yielded a harvest the world had never seen. Blades that glowed white upon touching the undead. Spears that dead flesh could not hold in its wound. Fiery iron, that is what the soldiers called it. Fiery iron won the second battle at Wolf's Ford, and with it the banner returned. And at the end of winter, Arlen resolved to do what had been brewing since autumn. He took Halvar, the mage in gray, and a dozen trusted men with him, and led them not to the fields, but deeper into the earth. In an old burrow by a dried-up riverbed, where the first cannonball had once been found, they dug for a week and uncovered the truth. The burrow was not a burrow at all, but the top tier of a staircase. The staircase, carved from black stone, wound downward in wide spirals, and its walls were adorned with bas-reliefs that made the mage in Gray's hands tremble. The bas-reliefs depicted fields, endless fields beneath a sunless sky. In these fields grew blades and towers and creatures, and entire mountains with eyes. And above the fields stood figures of sowers, with threads extending from their chests into the furrows. Below, the staircase ended at a gate as tall as a fortress wall. The gate was ajar by a palm's width, and warmth and the scent of freshly turned earth wafted through the crack. The thread beneath Arlen's ribs sang at the top of its voice here. The mage in gray read the inscription above the gate in a language unknown to any living person and said that the letters themselves implanted meaning in one's mind. The inscription read, "The farm sleeps, do not wake it until harvest." They did not enter. Arlen stood by the crack and sensed that beyond the gate lay neither evil nor good, but something so much greater that no measure could describe it. His gift was not a gift. His gift was a duty. A long time ago, someone had placed a watchman and a gardener over this land, and the post had stood vacant for centuries until they hired a village orphan who simply wanted to survive the war. And somewhere in Caldrek, there was a second such staircase and a second set of gates. And beyond them slumbered that which responded to the bone sower's thread. They climbed upward in silence. The mage in gray broke the silence once, and said that he now understood why the crown must not know about this. The crown would try to open the gates. Crowns always opened such gates. In the spring, the War of Gifts spread, and the world began to be reshaped. The Livonian Republic purchased from Westmar the right to a detachment of fiery iron, and the dead harvests of Caldrek gained a second front. The gnomes closed the mountain passes to Caldrek entirely. The southern kingdoms were sending envoys in a race, no longer to the crown, but personally to Arlen, and the crown administrator wrote reports denouncing every such letter. The noose tightened once more. Now entry into the valley required passing through 3 rings of checkpoints, and Arlen's personal guard was not under his command. He remained silent and sowed. The daytime harvest for the crown. The nightly tithe went to the ruins, where beneath the ashes, things were already brewing that not even Halvar knew about. And in the summer, Caldrek made the move that Arlen had been waiting for ever since that very night after the assassins. They couldn't come for him, so they came for what made him one of them. On the new moon, the earth of the valley shook and hummed, not from above, from below. The sentries at the deep outposts near the old burrow were the first to die. In 3 places in the valley, passages that hadn't been there yesterday burst open from beneath the ground. And from those passages emerged a special breed of undead. Blind white creatures bred for a single purpose, to dig and burn. They left the soldiers alone. They pounced on the garden beds and roots, burning everything made of iron and everything living with the acid they exhaled. Caldrek, the bone sower, had grown a harvest to counter the harvest. The night was hell both underground and above ground. The reapers crushed the white creatures by the hundreds, but the creatures had no intention of winning. Their only goal was to burn the roots. By dawn, the breaches had been filled in and doused with burning oil. Arlen went out to assess the losses and stood in the middle of the field. 9 trees were dead. A third of the beds were scorched to a glassy crust. But more terrifying than the toll was the very essence of it. The enemy had reached the roots through the earth. That meant it would reach them again, and that meant there was only one way to end the War of the Harvests. The one he'd dreamed of all winter. 2 sowers, a black field, and a judge who waits. The first battle against the undead was lost, but the alliance with Torvald's gnomes yielded runic fire iron, which restored the upper hand, and Liven and the gnomes entered the war on Westmar's side. An expedition to the old burrow uncovered a black staircase leading to half-open gates bearing the inscription, "The farm sleeps. Do not wake it until harvest time." Arlen realized that his gift was the role of guardian over the slumbering ancient farm, and that the bone-sour Caldrek had gates just like these of his own. An underground attack by the white undead burned 9 trees and a third of the garden beds, proving that the enemy could reach down to the roots, and Arlen resolved to engage the sour in single combat. The decision to fight hit a wall named the Crown,
And that wall turned out to be worse than the enemy.
Arlen presented his plan to the War Council to find the Bone Sower and kill him, because the dead crops die along with their master, just as his sprouts would wither without him. Osmond listened and refused. Not because the plan was bad, because the plan was good. The general had spoken aloud what had been kept silent in the valley for 2 years. Arlen was too valuable to risk and too dangerous to let out of sight. A farm without Arlen would die within a week, which meant that Arlen was the farm and the crown's property, and property does not go to duels. The crown administrator filed the decision away. The cage snapped shut, and a day later, news arrived that made the cage seem ridiculous. Caldric had broken through Livin's southern front, not with his army, with the harvest. The Bone Sower had grown what the prisoners called a walking burial mound. A mountain of dead flesh and bones 300 paces high, which marched a league an hour and took no notice of walls or fire. The mound devoured 2 fortresses and marched toward the sea, followed in orderly ranks by 60,000 dead, followed in even ranks.
Liven cried out for help.
Osmond received the king's order to lead the army south, and the army departed within a week, taking half the reapers and all the firearms from the warehouses. The valley was left with a garrison on the ramparts and silence in the fields. And on the very first quiet night, Arlen did what he had been preparing for a year. He came to the ravine beyond the northern ridge, where the unaccounted-for tithe was ripening, and uncovered the distant pit he had dug deeper than a well. There, his true trump card was maturing. He had planted the very heart of it all there last fall, his first blade forged from the first tree, the breastplate in which he had weathered his first siege. The cores of all 49 golems shattered in battle, and a drop of his own blood on each core, because iron remembers its master, and he wanted it to remember firmly. It was no reaper who rose from the pit. From the pit rose a knight, 3 times a man's height, with steel the color of the night sky, and Arlen sensed him not as a golem, but as a brother. Inside the knight, it was not the spark of a core that beat, but a weave of 49, and the thread between them was as thick as a rope. Arlen named him the Guardian. That very night, he wrote 3 letters. To Halvar, the truth and a request, to the mage in gray, a question about the gates, and to Edric, who had gone south with the army, an apology. And in the morning, he told the steward that he would be planting a large crop in the distant fields and set off for the ravine with 2 carts and the Guardian following close behind like a shadow. Only Halvar went with him, saying he had sworn an oath to the king, not to a cage, and the mage in gray, who said he had to see the second gate with his own eyes. The escape from his own life took an hour. Along a secret path through the southern scree, the very same one Edric had once used to lead his cavalry out. The pursuit was a day late because, as a parting gesture, the Guardian had carefully dismantled the bridge over the old riverbed. The journey south toward the breached front took 9 days and was a montage of others' misfortunes. Burned-out settlements, roads clogged with refugees, fields pockmarked with craters from the catapult mounds. At night, Arlen sowed swift, vicious crops along the road from his wagons, spiked harrows across the paths where the dead had walked, thickets of chainmail surrounding the surviving villages. He left behind a strip of land that bit back, and the refugees began to follow his wagons in a crowd as if following a... On the 10th day, they caught up with the war. Osmund's army stood near the city of Sarenvik, its back to the sea, preparing to die with dignity. The burial mound was a day's journey away, and its hump was already visible above the hills like a second mountain. Arlen rode into the camp without announcing himself, and they recognized him before he even dismounted. The soldiers shouted his name as if in prayer. Osmond emerged from his tent with the face of a judge and remained silent for a long time. Then he said that desertion warranted a court-martial, but he had no legal provision even for the Guardian, and that all this would take place after the battle, if there were anyone left to judge. The War Council listened to Arlen's plan in deathly silence. The mound cannot be destroyed from the outside. 3 fortresses had proven that. But the mound is a living crop, and every crop is drawn to its sower by a thread. The mage in gray had learned to see others' threads, even on the white creatures. The mound's thread led east, which meant the bone sower was following his crop, himself a day or two behind. The plan was madness in 2 acts. The army and the fiery iron would hold the kurgan and the ranks of the dead at Sarnvik at any cost. Meanwhile, Arlen, along with the Guardian and 100 volunteers, would march through the dead front toward the east, following the thread. Killing the sower would mean bringing down the burial mound and all 60,000 men at once. Osmond stared at the map, and everyone understood that he was weighing not the plan itself, but the right to dispose of others' lives. Lives that, on paper, were the property of the crown.
Then the general said something strange. He said that in 30 years of giving orders, this was the first time he'd seen crown property that had come to die for the king voluntarily, and that if it came to that, they would face a court-martial together. He assigned 100 of his best men and gave them 1 night to prepare. At dawn the next day, the kurgan arrived at Sarnvik, and the world trembled. And at that very hour, to the east, a small detachment was making its way across the hills. 100 horsemen, a farmer with gray hair at the age of 22, an old mage, Corporal Halvar, and a knight the color of the night sky, carrying a tree in a tub on his shoulder because Arlen had refused to go into single combat as a landless sower. The crown had forbidden Arlen from dueling, effectively declaring him its property. But the southern breakthrough by the walking burial mound of the bone sower and the withdrawal of Osmond's army gave him a chance. Arlen revealed the secret chamber and raised the Guardian, a knight 3 times his height, from his first breastplate blade and 49 cores imbued with his blood, after which he fled the valley with Halvar and the mage in gray. At Sarnwick, instead of a tribunal, Osmond accepted his plan. The army would hold the burial mound and the 60,000 dead, while Arlen, with the knight's guardian, 100 volunteers, and a tree in a tub, would head east along the thread of a foreign harvest to slay the bone sower. The thread of the burial mound led east, and the very first 10 leagues along it showed that they would have to pass through the land of the dead. The frontier was not a line. The front was a blot. The villages stood intact but empty because the inhabitants had been taken eastward alive, like seedlings. The fields had been plowed, but not with a plow. On every hill stood poles with bundles of bones, which the mage in gray called the sower's markers. Following these markers, the foreign harvest found its way as if along burning bonfires. The detachment marched at night and waited out the days in ravines and gullies. The sentry moved behind them at half a league's distance so that his footsteps would not give away the column. At every halt, Arlen watered the tree in the tub and fed it nails from his saddlebag. And the sapling held on, though its leaf plates had curled into tubes from the foreign soil. On the 3rd night, they were found, not by eyes, by nostrils. Dead hounds, creatures sewn together from wolf and human parts, picked up the scent and led a force of 500 in pursuit. The battle in the ravine that night was brief and terrifying. The fiery iron burned white hot. The Guardian worked by sound in the darkness, and nothing remained standing where he passed. They broke through, losing 19 men, and retreated along the stream bed, covering their tracks. After the battle, the mage in gray listened to the thread for a long time and spoke ill omens. The sower sensed the death of his hounds. Now he knows they are coming for him. On the 5th night, the landscape began to change, and the changes were worse than any ambush. The grass vanished, the earth became rich and black as humus, and warm to the touch in the middle of winter. Things grew out of the ground, bony trees bearing fruit that looked like closed eyes, fences made of vertebrae. The mage in gray said they had entered a garden, the sower's private garden, which he cultivated around himself just as Arlen had cultivated his valley. Here, the foreign thread hummed, no longer like a string, but like a bell. And Arlen felt through the soles of his feet a foreign warmth rising from a foreign depth. Somewhere beneath this garden lay a second gate. On the 6th night, the garden began to defend itself. Bony trees turned their fruit to face the column, and the fruit split open, and stared. Figures of the garden's former guests rose from the humus, weapons embedded in their palms. The detachment fought its way forward hour by hour and dwindled. By dawn on the 7th day, only 42 men remained of the 100, and then Halvar's detachment found on the hill what the threat had led them to. In the middle of the dead garden stood a manor house. A real old manor house with a turret and a weather vane, insanely ordinary amid the bone fences. And around the manor, vegetable beds were laid out in even circles, and in those beds a new army was ripening. Thousands of cocoons made of bone and sinew hung from black vines, and something stirred within them. A second army was maturing here, the younger brother of the one currently tearing down the walls of Sarenvik. A man stood by the manor's porch, gazing at the hill where the patrol had taken cover, as if he could see through miles of mist. Tall, skinny to the bone, dressed in the simple clothes of a gravedigger. A crown of bones rested on his chest, not on his head, but across his chest like a yoke. The mage in gray peered through his spyglass and drew in a sharp breath. He said he recognized that face from old records of his own service. The bone sower's name was Merton, and 20 years ago, he had been a village gravedigger on the borderlands of Kaldrek. And the Crown of Kaldrek had hired him for the position, just as the Crown of Westmar had hired Arlen. 2 crowns. 2 ordinary men torn from their places. The same depth lay beneath both of them. Arlen lay on the hill and looked at his enemy, but that face did not look like an enemy. It looked exhausted to the point of death. That night, at a war council in the ravine, they were deciding how to storm the manor. And Arlen listened with half an ear because the thread beneath his ribs suddenly behaved strangely. It wasn't pulling toward the manor, it was pulling toward the man on the porch. Warmth to warmth. Like 2 sprouts from the same field reaching toward each other. And then Arlen told the council something that made Halvar curse, and the mage in gray fall silent for a long time. He said there would be no nighttime assault and no knife in the back. He would go out to the manor alone in the morning and talk, because in the entire war, no one had ever tried exactly that. Halvar asked what would happen if death came instead of a conversation. Arlen replied that in that case, all the other plans would remain in effect, and the Guardian knew his business. In the morning, he came down from the hill and walked through the bone garden along the path between the beds of cocoons. He carried a tub with his little tree in his hands, just as one carries bread. Merton was waiting for him on the porch, motionless. Up close, it was clear that the gravedigger's eyes were just as sunken from sleeplessness as the farmer's, and his gray hair had come just as early. They stood facing each other, 2 sowers of 2 depths. Merton spoke first, his voice quiet and even. He said he'd been waiting for someone like this and was glad he'd waited before it all ended. Then he looked at the little tree in the tub with its curled leaves and did something Arlen hadn't expected at all. He asked permission to touch a living leaf. Because in his 20 years on the job, everything he'd touched had sprouted only death, and he'd forgotten what it was like when something alive grows. For 7 nights, the detachment had followed a thread through the land of the dead and the sower's personal bone garden, losing more than half its men, and had found an estate where a second burial mound was ripening in thousands of cocoons. The bone sower's name is Merton. He is a former gravedigger hired by the Crown of Kaldrek for the same position from the same depths, and his second gate lies beneath the garden. Arlen, defying the plan for an assault, went out to meet him alone with a sapling in a tub, and Merton, instead of fighting, asked to touch a living leaf. The conversation between the 2 sowers took place on the porch of the dead manor, and every word in it weighed more than a siege stone. Merton touched the steel leaf as carefully as one would touch a child and began to tell his story. 20 years ago, the Crown of Kaldrek found a gravedigger who had dreams of black fields and placed him above a burrow in its mountains. He too was promised protection, and a cage was built for him as well. He too was overloaded until blood flowed from his throat. There was one difference. The depths beneath Westmar responded to iron. The depths beneath Kaldrek responded to death. Merton said he hadn't chosen the harvest any more than Arlen had chosen his. A sower grows what his land accepts. Then he spoke of the main reason he spoke at all, rather than killing. His crown had issued an order he could no longer carry out. The second burial mound was not meant for the front lines. The second burial mound was meant for the gates. The sages of Kaldrek interpreted their bas-reliefs and concluded that beyond the gates lay a sleeping power strong enough to devour the entire continent, and that the harvest warned of in the inscription was, in fact, victory if you. Merton was ordered to grow the key. The burial mound was to be laid in the gate like a seed in a furrow, and awaken the farm from below. For 20 years, Merton had been sowing death on command and remained silent. But he was a gravedigger, and gravediggers are the only ones who truly respect the boundary between what is above and what is below. He said he would not open the gate and that for this refusal, his own crown had already sent a guard and mages after him. They would be here in 2 days. And then he asked Arlen directly, had the farmer come to kill him? Or would the farmer help him do what a gatekeeper must do? To seal them away forever. Arlen stood with the tub in his hands and felt the entire calculus of war crumbling. Killing Merton now meant bringing down the mound at Sarnwick, saving the army, and winning the campaign. And leaving the Kaldrek gates unguarded just as those who dream of opening them were about to arrive. He asked if it was possible to bring down the mound without killing the sower. Merton replied that it was. The sower could withdraw the thread from any of his crops, and the crop would wither, but the withdrawn thread would lash out at its master like a snapped rope, and after the mound, he would be crawling around for a week. And in 2 days, the guard would be here. Arlen made his decision so quickly that he startled himself. He called his men down from the hill. Halvar, the mage in gray, 40 fighters. And the guardian entered the bone garden with their weapons at the ready and stopped when they saw the 2 sowers sitting on the porch like neighbors. They devised the plan in an hour, and it was the craziest of all the previous ones. Merton would withdraw the burial mound's thread and save Sarnvik. The detachment would hold the estate for 2 days against Kaldrik's guard while the sower lay motionless. And then both sowers descend together to the gates of Kaldrek and seal them as recorded on the lower bas-reliefs that Merton had studied for 20 years. The seal is not set with stone or a spell. The seal is set by office. A sower may voluntarily return his gift to the depths, and the gift will become a bolt in the gate. The price is written there as well. He who returns his gift loses everything he has grown. The mage in gray asked about the gates of Westmar. Merton replied that the bolt on one side holds both doors shut because there is only one depth, but many entrances. Arlen heard this and said nothing about how loudly his heart was pounding. At noon, Merton stepped into the center of his garden, stood among the cocoons, and grasped the air as one would grasp a rope. His face turned gray, then white, then old. 300 leagues from here, at the walls of Sarnvik, the mountain of dead flesh halted half a step short and crumbled in on itself like a burnt-out fire, and 60,000 dead lay in rows where they had stood. Merton fell into Arlen's arms. Black blood flowed from his mouth, and he was smiling. And by evening, Halva's patrol brought news from the eastern road. Kaldrek's guard was advancing faster than expected. Not 2 days, 500 plate-armored soldiers, a dozen mages, and riding ahead on a black horse, a man in a crimson cloak, Kaldrek's chancellor himself, the very one who had held the keys to Merton's cell for 20 years and who had deciphered the bas-reliefs about the harvest. He was riding to open the gates in person. That night, Arlen inspected the defensive lines that 40 men and 1 guardian had managed to build and dig around the estate. He sowed from the last of the carts and from the bone fences because he had discovered something both terrifying and useful. The rich soil here accepted his iron eagerly, as if starving. At the stranger's gates, his crop grew faster than it did at home. The depth below was the same, and it recognized its second guardian. Before dawn, Arlen crouched by the tub with the sapling. The leaves of the tube unfurled. On the top branch overnight, a tiny blade had formed, more perfect than anything he'd grown in 2 years. The earth by the gate bestowed parting gifts. Arlen looked at the blade and realized that he'd already decided on the price of the bolt back on the porch. All that remained was to say it aloud and face the reactions of those who would hear it. Merton revealed that his crown had ordered him to grow a second mound as the key to opening the gate, and he had refused, for which Caldric had sent the guard and the Chancellor after him. They would arrive in just one day. Merton withdrew the thread and dropped the mound near Sarnvik, saving the army but abandoning the plan. Now the plan was to hold the estate and then have both sowers voluntarily return their gifts to the depths, sealing both doors with a single bolt at the cost of losing everything they had grown. Arlen discovered that his iron grew faster at the stranger's gates and silently decided on a price, though he had not yet declared it his own.
500 plate-armored warriors and a dozen mages against 40 living men and a single guardian, and all hope rested on the fact that the earth here obeyed Arlen as if it were his own. The night before the battle, he did not sleep a single minute and sowed. All the iron from the dead garden went into it. The bone fences were torn down, and seeds of war took their place.
The weapons of the fallen fighters of the 100. The trophies of the hounds of the outposts. The nails from the weather vane and the hinges of the manor itself. The rich, warm earth swallowed the plantings and pushed up sprouts in hours rather than days. By dawn, the estate stood within 3 rings. The outer ring was a spiked harrow as tall as a man. The middle ring consisted of chainmail vines that had entwined the bone trees into a solid wall. The inner ring consisted of 12 unripe soldier golems that Arlen had raised from the ground before their time, and paid for with a nosebleed that lasted until noon. Merton lay in the manor, gray as ash, but at dawn he ordered himself to be carried out onto the porch. He said that even a dying man could command a dead garden, and that some things in this garden would still serve a purpose. Calderec's guard arrived around noon, and the Chancellor and Crimson wasted no time on negotiations. He knew why he had come, and did not want to be late reaching the gates. The first assault was launched immediately in a mounted formation, and the outer defense reaped its harvest, so the second assault was carried out on foot and by the book. The mages rained fire upon the chainmail wall, and the wall burned and became overgrown, because Arlen stood in the middle ring, pouring his thread into the vines without regard for the cost. The plate-armored soldiers fought their way through all 3 rings for 4 hours, and every step cost them blood. At the inner ring, they were met by the Guardian. The surviving guardsman later recounted what happened next in whispers. A knight, the color of the night sky, stood alone in the breach against hundreds, and no one managed to pass through it. 49 cannonballs sang in unison within him, and Arlen heard that song through the roar, just as one hears a familiar voice in a crowd. By sunset, the Chancellor led the guard away, reorganized them, and put his reserves into action. A dozen mages merged their power into a single beam and struck, not at the rings nor at the Guardian, but at the manor. At the fallen Sour, because the Chancellor, too, knew how to count the threads. The manor's roof flew off in a shower of burning planks, and then the dead garden rose. With a final effort, Merton yanked all his threads at once, and thousands of unripe cocoons burst open throughout the garden. What emerged from them was no army. What emerged was premature, blind, and furious, and it did not distinguish its own, because it had no own. A wave of premature death swept across the battlefield, devouring everything, and Caldric's guard broke and fled, abandoning the wounded. The Chancellor was the last to leave. At the crest of the hill, he turned his horse around and gazed for a long time at the burning manor, and Arlen, across the entire field, met his gaze. It was not the look of a defeated man. It was the look of a man who understood that there was no need to break down the door if he could wait for the guard to die. By nightfall, everything had quieted down. The blind wave subsided of its own accord when the thread pulling it snapped. Of the 40 fighters, 11 were still on their feet. Halvar was alive. The mage in gray was alive but had lost hearing in his left ear. The guard stood in the breach, pecked to the very core of his heart, but he stood.
Merton was carried out of the burning manor alive and even conscious, and after taking roll call with his eyes, he signaled that it was time. 5 of them made their way down to the gates. 2 Sours, the mage in gray, acting as a witness. Halvar, because he refused to let them go, and the Guardian, carrying a tub with a sapling on his shoulder. The Caldric staircase was a twin of the Westmar staircase, except that the bas reliefs on the walls depicted not iron ears of grain, but fields of people sleeping beneath blankets of earth. The gates below stood ajar by the width of a palm, and the same warmth of a fresh furrow wafted through the crack. Before the gates, Merton explained the procedure inscribed on the lower stones. The sowers stand by the gateposts. Each takes his thread right at the root, beneath the ribs, and inserts it into the slit, just as one inserts a bolt into a hasp.
Voluntarily, resigning from their posts. The depth will accept their resignation and close until the true harvest, the timing of which is not for humans to know. The price will be paid immediately. Everything grown by both will be stripped of its threads. The mage in gray asked quietly whether Arlen understood what this meant for the valley, for the 40 trees, for the reapers, for the 120 soldier golems who now stand as garrisons across the entire southern front. Arlen replied that he had understood since yesterday, and that this was precisely why there was one last conversation he had to have, not with people. He approached the Guardian. The knight dropped to one knee so their eyes were level, took the tub from his shoulder and placed it between them. Arlen laid his hand on the pectet breastplate beneath which 49 cannonballs sang, and spoke aloud, unconcerned about those listening. He said that the bolt would take the thread, and that the Guardian would sleep as iron sleeps. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness, because a Guardian shouldn't have to apologize for locking the door. He said thank you. The Guardian listened without moving. Then he raised his hand and did something no one had ever taught him. He took that perfect tiny blade from the top branch of the little tree, placed it in Arlen's palm, and clasped his fingers around it. Iron remembers its master, even in sleep. The estate withstood the assault of 500 of the Chancellor's guards and mages, thanks to the 3 rings the Guardian had conjured overnight in the breach and Merton's final effort, raising a blind wave of unripe cocoons that shattered the guard. The Chancellor retreated, calculating that he would wait for the guards to die, and of the 40 fighters, 11 survived. 5 of them descended to the gates of Caldric, where Merton performed the ritual of the double bolt using voluntarily returned threads, at the cost of burying everything they had grown, and Arlen bid farewell to the Guardian, who himself placed a perfect blade, grown overnight, into his hand. Right at the gates, it became clear what Merton had been hiding until the very last moment, and what changed the entire price. The double bolt required 2 threads, but the clasps for them were not nearby. One clasp was here, near Caldric. The second was near Westmar, 300 leagues away. The bolt would engage only if both threads were inserted into the clasps at the same hour. Merton had always known this, and kept silent because he feared Arlen would turn back. It was a 2-week walk to the valley, and Merton was dying. The black blood was no longer flowing only from his throat. The recalled mound and the blind wave had burned him down to the wick, and he didn't have 2 weeks left. He had his days. The mage in gray found a solution, and it was the kind for which his order burned books. It wasn't necessary to carry the sour to the anchor in the flesh. A thread could be guided along another thread. The depth was 1, and Arlen felt its current beneath both staircases. If Arlen stood at Westmar's anchor and Merton at Caldric's, the mage could bind them through the current of the depth, just as 2 shores are bound by a rope, and the hour of convergence would become possible. To do this, the mage would have to remain below at the stranger's gate for the entire duration of the passage, because someone had to hold the rope. He said this matter-of-factly, as one might speak of a night watch, and everyone understood that he might not make it back up. The farewell down below was brief. Merton remained seated by the threshold of his depth with the mage in gray and his bone crown, which he had removed from his chest and placed nearby on a stone, just as one would remove a yoke.
Halvar, Arlen, and the Guardian, carrying the tub, climbed back up and headed west. And it was the fastest journey of Arlen's life. A relay of exhausted horses. The 11 surviving fighters remained at the very first outpost of Liven, with a letter for Osmond that contained everything about the gate, the bolt, and the chancellor.
From there, the three of them continued on. Through the retreating war, Kaldrek's dead ranks now lay scattered across the fields, devoid of their sowers' threads, and the living armies wandered among them, dazed by the silence. The rumor that the burial mound had fallen and the dead had risen spread along the roads faster than horses, and the farmer's name spread along with it. On the 8th day, Arlen saw the ridges of the Ash Valley, and his heart tightened at how much it looked like home. The valley welcomed him as it had never welcomed anyone before. The garrison poured out onto the ramparts. The town rang all its bells. The crown governor rushed out with an arrest warrant, and his own clerks shoved him aside with their shoulders. People stretched out to touch his stirrup, and Arlen looked over their heads at his fields. 40 trees in winter's iron frost. A line of reapers at the mouth of the valley. 120 soldier golems, their heads turned toward their master like sunflowers. In 2 days, all of this would fall silent by his own hand. He gathered everyone who had a right to know in the command tent, told them everything, and laid on the table a choice they didn't have, because the decision was made by the guard, not the garrison. There was an argument. There were shouts. The senior veteran of the ridges wept openly. But by midnight, the tent had fallen silent because everyone inside saw the walking burial mound, even if only from a distance. And everyone understood what would happen if one day a chancellor with a guard stood at the gate instead of a gravedigger with a conscience. For 2 days, the valley bid farewell to its harvest. It was unlike anything else. Soldiers approached the reapers with whom they had stood under siege and spoke words to them. The ridge dwellers tied ribbons around the trees, just as brides are adorned. Torvald's gnomes, who had galloped up on the last breaths of their horses, carved the rune of sleep onto the breastplate of every golem, a rune that, according to their faith, promises awakening. And Arlen spent those 2 days fulfilling the final duty of his office. He planted a sapling from a tub in the very heart of the valley, on the site of the first garden bed where a broken sword had once sprouted. And nearby, he dug a grave for the guardian. The knight laid himself down in the earth. He sank into the grave as if into a bed, placed his blade alongside his body, and looked up at his master calmly and clearly. Arlen covered him with earth with his own hands, and wouldn't let anyone help. At the appointed hour, he descended alone into the old burrow via the black staircase of Westmar, past the bas-reliefs with iron ears of grain. Halvar escorted him to the first step and stood there with a torch like a sentry. Below, the gate waited, ajar just wide enough for a hand, and the warmth of the furrow stood in the gap. Arlen stood by the bracket and called out into the depths, and the depths answered. Through the current from below came the touch of a rope twisted by the will of a foreign mage in gray, and along the rope, the faint but steady presence of Merton, like a handshake across 300 leagues. Everyone was in their places. Arlen grasped the thread at its very root beneath his ribs, where it had grown from him for 26 months, and pulled. The pain was not pain. The pain was parting. Before his eyes flashed all the stages of growth, from the first sprout to the guardian, and each sprout let him go in turn, just as fingers let go. The thread emerged from him glowing and alive, and he placed it in the clamp and felt, at that very moment, a second one settle into its clamp 300 leagues away. The gates of Westmar trembled and began to move. The leaves closed without a crash, with the quiet sound of a barn being shut for the winter. The inscription above them went dark. The warmth of the furrow vanished from the air, and above, across the entire valley, in a single second, iron frost rained down from 40 trees, and 120 golems and 8 reapers bowed their heads and froze, and it grew very quiet. Arlen stood before the closed gates, as empty as a freshly dug hole.
Then he turned and walked up the stairs toward the light of the torch. The climb took an eternity because, for the first time in 2 years, he was climbing as a mere human.
The bolt turned out to be a double one with 2 clasps under the 2 kingdoms, and the mage in gray, who had remained at the gates of Caldric, ensured the connection remained intact through the depths, standing beside the dying Merton. Arlen returned to the valley 8 days later, announced the price to the garrison, and spent 2 days bidding farewell to the harvest, burying the guardian with his own hands next to the transplanted sapling on the site of the first garden bed. At the appointed hour, both threads were secured in the gate's clamps. The gates of both depths closed forever, and all that had been grown fell asleep, while Arlen ascended as an ordinary man without the gift. The war died more quietly than it had lived, and the first to realize this was not the king, but a soldier at the outpost, who one morning saw no one on the other side. Caldrec collapsed from within in a single spring. The empire, which had stood for 3 years on dead harvests, was left without harvests, without a burial mound, and without fear. And the chancellor, clad in crimson and returning from the closed gates empty-handed, was met by his own nobility as the culprit behind it all.
He was judged by his own people. In the summer, Caldric requested peace, and the peace treaty was signed in the fall on neutral ground. Arlena was brought there as one brings a banner. He sat in a corner of the hall as a mere witness and listened as the powers divided the credit for the peace they had not earned. He didn't care. He looked out the window at the foreign fields and thought that it was time to go home to sow the winter crops. The real ones. Barley. He had settled his accounts with the Crown of Westmar back in the spring, and the settlement had come as a surprise to both sides. When it became clear that there would be no more gifts, a document arrived from the capital revoking his status as a supplier and revising his land rights. Because the crown does not keep the useless. Lord Wyndham delivered the document personally, and Arlen expected to be arrested. But instead, the old man placed a second document from the king beside it. A deed of gift. Ash Valley was granted to Arlen's family in perpetuity for services rendered to the crown and the continent, with exemption from taxes for 3 generations.
Wyndham dryly explained that a dead hero is a monument, but a living aggrieved hero is a banner for any rebellion, and the crown knows how to calculate. Then, for the first time in all their acquaintance, the old man spoke from the heart. He said he had seen many people shatter the world by force, and for the first time, he was seeing a man who, having received power capable of shattering everything, had chosen to bury it, and that if Arlen ever grew tired of tilling the soil, there would always be a place in the capital for minds like his. Arlen thanked him and declined the offer in a single sentence. The mage in gray returned. He emerged from the foreign gates a week after they'd been sealed, now deaf in both ears but alive, and brought Arlen the final request. Merton had died at his own gates an hour after the bolt was drawn, having seen the matter through to the end, and the gravedigger's last words were a request: to bury him up above, under the open sky, in simple earth, without a single bone nearby. The mage carried it out himself. On the grave, following the custom of his forgotten homeland, he planted an apple tree, and as he walked away, he looked back and swore that he had seen the first living grass sprouting through the dead soil of the garden just a day later. The depths had closed, but in the end, they had repaid their debts. The years after the war passed in the way a good life should. The valley came back to life. Over the course of 3 years, the ashes had burned into the soil, and the very first real barley harvest stood waist-high like a wall. On harvest day, Arlen walked among the ears of grain, touching them, unable to believe that they were growing on their own, without a single thread or a trace of pain. The settlement became a small town called 17th Allotment, inhabited by a mix of garrison veterans, ridge families, and Torvald's gnomes, who had opened a blacksmithing school there. Halvar retired and became the town's mayor. His first act was to issue a decree prohibiting anyone from digging a well deeper than a certain depth without his personal permission. Everyone understood why, and no one argued. Edric rose to the rank of marshal and came once a year without an entourage. He and Arlen would quietly get drunk on the porch and keep their own thoughts to themselves. Osmond wrote his memoirs, and the chapter on Zarnvik was titled honestly, "We were saved by the crown's property," which turned out to be a person. The sleeping harvest remained standing where it was. At first, the crown sent scholars, and for a year the scholars tapped the reapers with small hammers and left empty-handed because iron without a thread was simply iron of wondrous workmanship. Gradually, the sleepers became part of the valley's life. 40 trees became a grove of rendezvous. Children played among the ranks of soldier golems at the valley's mouth and hung wreaths on them during holidays. And the guardian's grave, next to the tree from the tub, became a place where residents went in times of trouble to talk, and this was not considered strange. The tree, by the way, was alive. It was the only one of the entire iron harvest that did not fall completely asleep. Once a year in the spring, a single small blade would form on its uppermost branch, and by fall, it would crumble into the grass as floral rust. The mage in gray studied this miracle for 10 years and finally wrote in his journal that the depth sleeps, but its dreams are kind. Arlen married the daughter of the ridge foreman. They had a daughter and 2 sons, and none of the 3 ever had dreams of the black fields. And he checked this every morning for many years, until he stopped being afraid. He lived his life as a farmer, just as he had wanted to be on that day in Heldorn Square. He sowed, he harvested, he repaired the roof. He quarreled with Halvar over the boundary and made up with him by evening. Slava searched for him for another 20 years through letters and messengers, and finally gave up, yielding to a legend in which everything was beautifully distorted. But the valley knew the truth, and that was enough for the valley. Many years later, now truly gray-haired, Arlen went out as he did every evening before bed to walk to the first garden bed. It was autumn. The barley had been harvested. He sat down on a bench by the guardian's grave under a tree from which flour-like rust was falling, and placed his palm on the ground as if greeting it. The earth was simply warm. It was the usual September warmth that comes from the sun, not from deep within the earth. Somewhere in the house, his wife was calling their youngest son to dinner. Near the ghat, children were laughing by the sleeping guard post. Arlen sat there a little longer, listening to it all, and spoke softly, aloud, to the earth and the iron and everything that slept and lived around him. One word. Thank you. Then he stood up and walked toward the house where a light was on. The gate was closed. The harvest had been gathered. The story ended just as a farmer's story should end. With peace, with bread, and with the silence he himself had cultivated. Kaldrek collapsed without the Chancellor's dead harvests. His own people judged him, and in the fall, a peace treaty was signed, and the crown of Westmar, instead of seizing the useless gift, permanently secured the valley for Arlen's lineage. Merton died having fulfilled his duty and was buried under an apple tree. The mage in gray returned alive. Halvar became the mayor of the town of 17th Allotment, and the dormant iron harvest became ingrained in the peaceful life of the valley like a monument. Arlen lived out his life as an ordinary farmer with his family on his land. Every spring, the guardian tree grows a single blade, like a sweet dream from the depths. At the very locks, it became clear what Merton had been hiding until the very last moment. And what changed everything. The double bolt required 2 threads, but the clasps for them were not nearby. One bracket is here, near Kaldrek. The second is near Westmar, 300 leagues away. The bolt would engage only if both threads were inserted into the brackets at the same time. Merton had always known this, and kept silent because he feared that Arlen would turn around and leave, leaving him to die at the gate, alone face to face with the returning Chancellor. He confessed this, staring straight at the floor, and Halvar cursed so loudly that the echo reverberated down the staircase. It was a 2-week walk to the valley, and Merton was dying. Black blood was no longer flowing only from his throat. The withdrawn burial mound and the blind wave had burned him down to the wick, and he had no 2 weeks left. He had days. Maybe 6. Maybe 4. He himself counted each morning how many fingers he could clench into a fist, and the count was going down. The mage in gray found a solution, and it was the kind for which his own order burned books along with their authors. The sour did not necessarily have to be carried to the anchor in the flesh. The thread grows not from the body, but from what lies deeper than the body. There is only one depth, and Arlen felt its current beneath both staircases, just as one feels a single river from both banks. If Arlen stood at Westmar's anchor and Merton at Caldrick's, the mage could connect them through the current of the depth, just as two banks are connected by a rope, and the hour of convergence would become possible. To do this, the mage would have to remain below at the enemy's gate for the entire duration of the passage, because someone had to keep the rope taut and prevent the current from sweeping him away.
He said this matter-of-factly, as if discussing a night shift.
Halvar asked what would happen to the one holding the rope if it snapped. The mage replied that in that case, the question of his return to the surface would resolve itself, and asked them to stop wasting time on the arithmetic of others' lives. Everyone understood that he might not make it back up, and that he had realized this before anyone else. The farewell down below was brief, because a long farewell is a luxury of the living, and here there was no right to it. Merton remained seated by the thresholds of his own depths, wrapped in cloaks, with the mage in gray beside him. He removed the bone crown from his chest and placed it on a stone, just as one removes a yoke after the final furrow, and said that for 20 years it had weighed more than it actually did. Then he called Arlen over and spoke with him privately for a short while. He said he envied him in just one way. The farmer has a place to return to, but the gravedigger's home had been right here below all these years. He asked for one thing. When it's all over, let someone bury him up above, under the real sky and simple earth, and let there be not a single bone nearby. Arlen promised, and they shook hands, and Merton's hand was already cold. They climbed upward in silence. Halvar, Arlen, and the Guardian, with a tub on his shoulder, emerged from the burrow into the gray dawn and set off westward, and it was the fastest journey of Arlen's life. A montage of overworked horses and brief naps in the saddle. They were given their first change of horses at the Liven crossroads, where the centurion recognized Arlen by sight and silently handed over the best ones. The 11 surviving fighters remained at the same outpost with a letter for Osmond that contained everything about the gate, the bolt, the chancellor, and the price. Arlen spent an hour writing this letter and tore up 2 drafts because he didn't know how to explain to the general that the weapon that had won the war needed to be put to sleep. In the end, he wrote simply, "You've seen the burial mound. Imagine that the burial mound is the smallest thing that could come out of the open door." Then the 3 of them continued on, through the retreating war. Caldrick's ranks of the dead now lay scattered across all the fields, severed from the threads of their sower, and the living armies wandered among them, dazed by the silence. On the 3rd day of their journey, they saw soldiers from 2 hostile outposts digging a common trench together to bury the fallen, because they couldn't manage it on their own. No one fired a shot. The rumor that the mound had fallen and the dead lay scattered spread along the roads faster than horses, and the farmer's name spread along with it, growing over with tall tales. In a roadside tavern, Arlen listened as a one-legged veteran recounted that the farmer was as tall as a tower and sowed lightning, and he didn't correct him. On the 8th day, Arlen saw the ridges of Ash Valley, and his heart tightened at how much it looked like home. 2 years ago, he'd come here to die. Now he was coming here to bury the very thing that had saved him. The valley welcomed him as it had never welcomed anyone before. The garrison poured out onto the ramparts. The town rang all its bells. The crown governor ran out with an arrest warrant for unauthorized departure, and his own clerks shoved him aside with their shoulders. One of them stepped on the fallen paper and didn't apologize. People stretched out to touch the stirrup. Women lifted their children above their heads. And Arlen looked over their heads at his fields, his eyes dry only because he'd already cried his fill on the road at night while Halvar pretended to sleep. 40 trees in winter's iron frost,
a line of reapers at the mouth of the valley. 120 soldier golems, their heads turned toward their master like sunflowers. All of this would fall silent at his own hand in 2 days.
He gathered everyone who had a right to know in the command tent, the garrison officers, the senior field commanders, and the messenger from Torvald, the manager who had nowhere else to go. And he laid out everything, from the ladder to the bracket, and placed on the table a choice they didn't have because the decision was made by the watchman, not the garrison. There was an argument. There were shouts. A young lieutenant shouted that this was a betrayal of the army, which was now stationed in the south under the cover of the reapers. A senior veteran of the ridges named Odd, who had slept in a hut between the ridges for 2 years, wept openly and asked who would wake the trees if not Arlen. And Arlen answered honestly that he didn't know and that perhaps no one ever would. By midnight, the tent had fallen silent because everyone inside saw the walking burial mound, even if only from a distance. And everyone understood what would happen if one day a chancellor with a guard stood at the gate instead of a gravedigger with a conscience. The steward was the last to speak, and everyone waited for him to snitch, but he said he would submit a letter of resignation to the capital because the crown could guard the sleeping iron just fine without him. For 2 days, the valley bid farewell to its harvest. It was unlike anything else, and Arlen remembered those days more vividly than any of his battles. Soldiers came to the reapers with whom they had laid siege and spoke words to them that they would never say to the living. The furrowers tied ribbons around the trees as one ties them around a bride. And Odd personally went around all 40 and stood by each one. Torvald's gnomes, who had galloped up on the last breath of their horses, carved a rune of sleep onto the breastplate of each golem, a rune that, according to their faith, promises awakening. And Torvald said that the mountains know how to wait and will teach the valley to do the same. And Arlen spent those 2 days performing the final duty of his office. He planted a sapling from a tub in the very heart of the valley, on the site of the first garden bed where a broken sword had once sprouted. The earth readily accepted the roots, and the leaf-like plates unfurled in the winter sun. And nearby, Arlen dug a grave for the guardian. He dug it himself. Halvar brought a second shovel and was sent away. The knight laid himself in the ground. He sank into the grave as if into a bed, laid the blade along his body as one sheathes a sword, and looked up at his master calmly and clearly. In that gaze there was neither fear nor reproach, but only acceptance. Arlen covered him with earth with his own hands and wouldn't let anyone help. And when the last handful fell upon the breastplate, he smoothed the earth with his palm, just as one smooths a blanket over a sleeping child. At the appointed hour before dawn, he descended alone into the old burrow down the black staircase of Westmar, past the bas-reliefs with iron ears of grain. Halvar led him to the first step and stood there with a torch like a sentry, saying he would remain there until Arlen emerged, and that to emerge was an order from the future town's elder, and the elder's orders were not to be questioned. Below, the gates awaited, a jar just wide enough for a hand, and the warmth of the furrow stood in the gap. Arlen stood by the bracket and called out into the depths, and the depths answered. A current from below brought the touch of a rope twisted by the will of a foreign mage in gray, and through the rope came Merton's faint but steady presence, like a handshake across 300 leagues. Merton had survived. Everyone was in their places. Arlen grasped the thread at its very root beneath his ribs, where it had grown from him for 26 months, and pulled. The pain was not pain.
The pain was parting. Before his eyes flashed all the stages of growth, from the first crooked sprout to the guardian, and each sprout released him in turn, just as the fingers of an opening hand let go. The guardian was the last to let go, and he, with rock, 9 cores, sang a single long note and fell silent.
The thread emerged from him, glowing and alive, and he placed it in the clasp and felt, at that very moment, a second one settle into its clasp, 300 leagues away. The gates of Westmar trembled and began to move. The wings closed without a crash, with the quiet sound of a barn being shut for the winter when the harvest is gathered and the master goes his home. The inscription above them faded, letter by letter. The warmth of the furrow vanished from the air, and it became simply cold, like in any dungeon in the world. And above, across the entire valley, in a single second, iron frost rained down from 40 trees with a quiet tinkling, and 120 golems and 8 reapers bowed their heads and froze, and it became very quiet. So quiet that the sentries on the ramparts could hear snow falling on snow. Arlen stood before the closed gates, as empty as a dugout hole. There was nothing beneath his ribs, no warmth, no thread, no call. Only a heart that beat like that of any human. Then he turned and walked up the stairs, toward the light of the torch that awaited him. The climb took an eternity because, for the first time in 2 years, he was climbing as a mere human, and a mere human's legs grow weary, while a mere human's shoulders remember everything they've carried. On the top step, Halvar silently offered his shoulder, and the two of them stepped out into the dawn together.
The latch turned out to be a double one, with threads simultaneously threaded through the clasps beneath the two kingdoms, and the mage in gray, who had remained below at the stranger's gates, next to the dying Merton, who had asked to be buried upstairs without a single bone nearby, took it upon himself to maintain the connection through the depths. Arlen returned to the valley 8 days later, having weathered the dispute and the garrison's 2-day farewell to the harvest. He planted a sapling where the first garden bed had been, and with his own hands buried the guardian who had voluntarily laid himself to rest in the earth. At the appointed hour, both threads settled into the gate's brackets. The gates of both depths closed forever. The entire iron harvest fell asleep, and Arlen climbed the stairs as an ordinary man without the gift, and Halvar met him on the top step. The war died more quietly than it had lived, and the first to realize this was not the king, but a soldier at the outpost, who one morning saw no one on the other side, and hesitated for half a day to report it because he was afraid of disturbing the silence. Kaldrek collapsed from within in a single spring. The empire, which had stood for 3 years on dead harvests, was left without harvests, without a burial mound, and without the fear that had served as its treasury and faith. The cities refused to pay the war tax. Regiments were melting away on the roads home. And the chancellor, clad in crimson, returned from the closed gates empty-handed and was met by his own nobility as the culprit behind it all. The nobility reminded him of everything, from the burned-down outposts to the gravedigger whom he had kept caged for 20 years. He was tried by his own people, and when Arlen learned of the verdict, he felt nothing but weary pity. For the man who had longed to open the door to the depths had never understood that the depths do not open to those who force their way in. In the summer, Kaldrek requested peace, and the peace treaty was signed in the fall on neutral ground in a city by the sea. Arlen was brought there as one brings a banner. He sat in a corner of the hall as a mere witness, wearing a new caftan that pinched at the shoulders, and listened as the great powers divided the credit for a peace they hadn't earned. Ambassador Liven attributed the victory to the Republic's gold. The marshals argued over the decisive battle. The word farm did not appear even once in the final treaty, and Arlen caught himself being glad of that. He didn't care either way. He looked out the window at the foreign fields, where peasants were plowing the fallow soil, and thought about how it was time to sow the winter crops back home. The real ones. Barley. He'd settled his accounts with the Crown of Westmar back in the spring, and the settlement had come as a surprise to both sides. When it became clear that there would be no more gifts, a letter arrived from the capital revoking his status as a supplier and revising his land rights because the crown keeps nothing useless. Lord Wyndham delivered the document personally, and Arlen expected to be arrested. He'd even packed his bag. But instead, the old man placed a second document from the king beside it. A deed of gift. Ash Valley was granted to Arlen's family in perpetuity for services rendered to the crown and the continent, with exemption from taxes for 3 generations and the right to self-governance for the town. Wyndham dryly explained that a dead hero is a monument, while a living, aggrieved hero is a banner for any rebellion, and the crown knows how to calculate, even when it expresses gratitude. Then, for the first time since they'd known each other, the old man spoke from the heart, and his voice took on a different tone as he spoke those words. He said that he had served 4 kings in a row,
and had seen many people shatter the world by force. Yet for the first time, he was seeing a man who, having received the power to destroy everything, had chosen to bury it.
And that if Arlen ever grew tired of toiling, there would always be a place in the capital for minds like his. Arlen thanked him and declined the offer in a single sentence, and Wyndham nodded as if he hadn't expected any other answer, and this response comforted him in some way. The mage in gray returned.
He set out from the foreign gates a week after they were closed, now deaf in both ears but alive, and reached the valley by summer. From the threshold, he demanded paper and a quill, for he could now communicate only in writing. He brought Arlen the final one. Merton died at his post an hour after the gate was bolted, having seen the matter through to the end. Before his death, he wrote 3 words on a stone with a piece of charcoal. The harvest has been gathered in its entirety. The gravedigger's final request was to be buried up above, under the open sky in simple earth without a single bone nearby, and the magician himself dug the grave with hands deafened by the depths. On the grave, following the custom of his forgotten homeland, he planted a wild apple tree that had grown near the burned-down estate. As he left, he looked back and later swore in writing that he had seen the first living grass sprout through the dead earth of the bone garden 2 days later, like 2 green fingers. The depths had closed over, but in the end, they had repaid their debts. The years after the war unfolded like a montage, just as a good life should, without any cliffhangers. The valley came back to life. Over the course of 3 years, the ashes had burned into the soil, and the very first real barley harvest stood waist-high like a wall. On harvest day, Arlen walked among the ears of grain and touched them, unable to believe that they were growing on their own, without a thread, without pain, without payment, just from the sun, water, and work. That day, he got drunk for the first time in his life, and Halvar drove him home in a wagon, and the 2 of them sang. The settlement became a small town called 17th Allotment, and the name was chosen by a vote to spite everyone who had suggested naming it after a hero. The town was home to a mix of garrison veterans, ridge-dwelling families, refugees from the south, and Torvald's gnomes, who had opened a blacksmithing school there where children were taught that the soul of steel is opened through patience. Halvar retired, became the town elder, and his first act was to issue a decree prohibiting anyone from digging a well deeper than a certain depth without his personal permission. Everyone understood why, and no one argued. The decree was rewritten every year as if it were an oath. Edric rose to the rank of marshal and would visit once a year without an entourage, wearing a simple cloak, and he and Arlen would drink quietly on the porch, saying nothing about their own affairs, and that silence was the best conversation of the year for both of them. Osmund retired and wrote his memoirs, and in them, the chapter on Sarnvik was titled, Honestly. We were saved by the crown's property, which turned out to be a man. He sent Arlen the manuscript before it went to press, with a single line written across the top. Cross out whatever you want. Arlen didn't cross out a thing. The dormant harvest remained standing where it stood. At first, the crown sent scientists, and for a year, the scientists tapped the reapers with hammers, cut samples, and left empty-handed because the iron without a thread was simply iron of wondrous workmanship that neither rust nor time could touch. Gradually, the sleeping ones became part of the valley's life, as part of it and as its memory. 40 trees became a grove of rendezvous, and beneath them 3 generations declared their love. Children played among the ranks of the soldier golems at the pass and hung wreaths on them during holidays, and every child in the town knew their counting rhyme by name, names that the ranks themselves had not once borne but now bore forever. And the guardian's grave, next to the tree made from a tub, became a place where residents would go in times of trouble to sit and talk. And this was not considered strange. It was believed that the guardian listened better than anyone else in the valley because he never interrupted. The tree, incidentally, was alive. It was the only one of the entire iron harvest that did not fall asleep until the very end. Once a year in the spring, a single small blade of perfect form would sprout on the uppermost branch, and by fall, it would crumble into the grass as floral rust,
and no one ever plucked it before its time. The mage in gray studied this wonder for 10 years, filled 3 chests with paper in his notes, and finally wrote the last line on the matter in his journal. The depths sleep, but their dreams are kind. Arlen married Ingrid, the daughter of Odd, the Ridge Elder, the very one who, during the harvest farewells, tied flax to the trees without hiding her tears. They had a daughter and 2 sons, and none of the 3 ever had dreams of the Black Fields. Arlen checked on this every morning at breakfast for many years, asking the same question about dreams, until one day his daughter asked why he was asking, and he realized he had stopped being afraid a year earlier. The gift was not passed down. The position was closed off, not inherited, and that was for the best. He lived his life as the farmer he had wanted to be on that day in Heldorn Square, when 400 people laughed at his choice. He sowed, he reaped, he repaired the roof. He taught his sons how to wield a scythe and his daughter how to haggle with merchants because she was the best at it. He quarreled with Halvar over the boundary every spring
And made up with him by evening over the same table. Glory sought him out for another 20 years through letters, messengers, and once even a marriage proposal from the Southern King, but finally gave up, yielding to the legend in which everything was beautifully embellished.
In the legend, the farmer was a giant, and his sword split mountains. The valley knew the truth, and that was enough for it. Many years later, now truly gray-haired, not from Arlen's gift, he went out as he did every evening before bed to walk to the first garden bed. It was autumn. The barley had been harvested, and the fields lay bare and at rest. He walked slowly because his knee ached from the rain, and it was an honest pain earned over the years, not from the depths below. He sat down on a bench by the guardian's grave, under a tree from which the last floral rust of the year was falling, and placed his palm on the ground, just as he had greeted it all these years. The earth was simply warm, the usual September warmth that comes from the sun, not from what lies beneath. And that was the best thing the earth could say to him. Somewhere in the house, Ingrid was calling her youngest son to dinner, and her voice carried across the fields, just as it had for 30 years. Near the mountain pass, children were laughing by the sleeping ranks, and one of them was arguing loudly about whose turn it was to place a wreath on the largest figure. At the blacksmith school, small hammers clattered as the students finished their lesson. Odd's grandson's wagon creaked. The valley resounded with life that no one would once have valued for a penny. Arlen sat a little longer, listening to it all as one listens to a favorite song, and then spoke aloud, softly, to the earth and the iron and the grass and everything that slept and lived around him, a single word. "Thank you." The earth did not answer, and he smiled because silence was exactly what he wanted. Then he stood up, leaning on the bench, and walked toward the house where a light was on and the table was being set. The gate was closed. The harvest had been gathered. The debt had been paid in full, down to the last grain. The story ended just as the story of a farmer who wanted only to survive the war, but instead grew peace, was meant to end. With bread on the table, with light in the window, and with the silence he had cultivated himself, which now grew on without him. Kaldrek collapsed without the Chancellor's dead crops. His own people condemned him, and in the fall, a peace treaty was signed in which the farmer's name was not even mentioned, while the Crown of Westmar, instead of arresting him, permanently secured the valley for the Arlen family through the words of Wyndham, who acknowledged the man who had buried the all-powerful gift. Merton died in the line of duty and was buried beneath an apple tree. Afterward, living grass sprouted on the barren earth. The mage in gray returned, deaf but alive. Halvar became the mayor of the town of 17th Allotment, with a ban on digging deeper than the well, and the slumbering harvest became woven into peaceful life as a memory and a place of power. Arlen lived a long life as a farmer with Ingrid and their 3 children, free from dreams of the Black Fields. Each spring, the guardian tree grows a single blade, like a sweet dream from the depths, and the story concludes with the hero's gratitude to the earth, for bread, the light in the window, and the silence he cultivated.